So, picture this. There's a guy, and he looks like he just walked out of the Stone Age. Thick, unruly beard, long, wild hair, a frame like a battering ram. If you're the opposing team and you see him bearing down on you, you might reconsider your life choices. His name? Sébastien Chabal. And in France, in the world of rugby, that name carries a kind of mythic weight. They call him l'homme des Cavernes, the Caveman, and he wears that title like a badge of honor. But here's the thing, Chabal wasn't always this rough and tumble figure. Underneath the hair and the muscle was a guy who once sat at a desk, shuffling through balance sheets. Yeah, seriously. Before rugby took over his life, he was actually on track to be an accountant. Can you imagine it? The wild man of rugby, one of the game's most infamous enforcers, sitting in an office doing people's taxes. It's almost unbelievable. But that's Sébastien Chabal for you. Full of surprises, contradictions, and maybe a bit of marketing genius too. See, from the moment Chabal started to show up on the rugby field looking like some kind of medieval warlord, he was different. Not just in looks, but in his whole presence. Fans loved him. They didn't just want to watch him, they wanted to be him. In a sport where physicality is everything, Chabal brought a kind of theatricality. He turned the raw, gritty violence of rugby into something mesmerizing. And he was more than willing to lean into that image, the monster people wanted him to be. For a lot of players, that kind of image could become a cage. But for Chabal, it was a platform. The wild hair, the piercing stare, the silent, intimidating aura, all of it became his brand. But with fame comes critics, right? And Chabal had plenty. A lot of them would say that he was all hype and not enough substance, especially as his career went on. They'd point to his stats, saying he didn't score as many tries as some of the other greats, or that he didn't have the same technical finesse as the top-tier players. Overhyped, they'd say. Yet, somehow, that criticism never really stuck. Because here's the thing, people weren't just watching Chabal for the scores, they were watching him for the spectacle. The possibility of that one massive, bone-crunching tackle, the way he'd power through a line of defenders, head down, like a force of nature. You could say that Chabal was a sort of paradox. To the fans, he was the ultimate enforcer, a guy who would go out there and smash his opponents, all while looking like he belonged in a prehistoric battlefield. But to his detractors, he was something else entirely. A symbol of rugby's commercialization, a walking caricature of French rugby's brutality. They felt he represented a side of the game that prioritized show over skill. And sure, maybe he didn't have the finesse of some of the greats. He wasn't always the guy who would glide through a defensive line with graceful footwork or make a game-winning play at the last second. But Chabal's value went beyond the scoreboards and stats. He was a living, breathing character, and that's exactly what rugby needed, especially when it came to drawing new fans in. But let's not forget, beneath the gruff exterior, he was still just a guy. He had his vulnerabilities, his quiet moments. In interviews, he could come across as surprisingly soft-spoken, even gentle. He didn't boast, he didn't need to. The media would often portray him as this rugby monster, this brutal, merciless giant who lived for the tackle. Yet, if you looked a bit closer, you'd see a guy who had simply found his niche, found a role that fit him well, and ran with it. And that role didn't define his entire life. Outside of the stadium, he could be that former accountant, that guy who you'd be surprised to find having a quiet meal with his family. One of the most memorable things about Chabal was how he embraced the duality of his image. He played into it, but he never seemed swallowed by it. When fans chanted his name, he'd acknowledge them with a quick nod, as if he were saying, "Yeah, I know what you came here to see." He once admitted he didn't see himself as a superstar, just a guy who loved to play hard. But he also knew how to use his image to his advantage, especially when it came to marketing. Advertisements and magazines loved him, always placing him in scenarios that exaggerated his caveman persona, sometimes with a wink, sometimes with full commitment. However, there was always that tension, this larger-than-life image versus the actual performance on the field. Some would argue that Chabal became better known for his look and his aura than for any actual accomplishments on the pitch, especially as he moved into the later years of his career. Critics were quick to pounce on this, arguing that he wasn't pulling his weight, that the Caveman was more hype than bite. And maybe, in some ways, they had a point. Maybe Chabal's popularity outpaced his achievements. But then again, when has rugby ever been just about stats? Sports aren't spreadsheets, right? They're drama, they're emotion, they're stories. And that's what Chabal delivered every time he stepped onto the field. He became a symbol, a face people would recognize even if they didn't follow rugby religiously. And that's something not every player can achieve, no matter how many points they rack up. As his career began to wind down, there was this sense that Chabal was transitioning from player to myth. He wasn't just leaving rugby, he was becoming a story, a legend people would talk about for years. He didn't necessarily leave with a trophy-studded career, but he left with a kind of fame that most athletes can only dream of. The beard, the hair, the terrifying scowl, all of it became a part of rugby's history. Fans might argue over his legacy, whether he was overhyped or truly one of the greats, but they'll all agree on one thing: Chabal was unforgettable. In the end, Chabal's story isn't just about rugby. It's about the power of image, the way one person can capture the imagination of millions. It's about the fine line between performance and persona, between the athlete you see on the field and the person they are outside of it. Sure, he might have started out as an accountant, but somewhere along the line, he became a caveman, a colossus, a legend. And whether or not he was the greatest player to ever live, he played a role that made the sport just a bit more thrilling, a bit more magical. And that's the thing about Sébastien Chabal. He didn't just play rugby, he embodied it. There's this quote by him where he said something along the lines of, "I don't do it for the people watching. I do it because I like to play rugby hard." For Chabal, rugby was pure. It was about grit, about the hit and tackle grind. He didn't play with elegance or grace. He played like a man who knew how to take hits as much as he knew how to dish them out. He wasn't afraid to get hurt, and he wasn't afraid to hurt others either, at least on the field. Off it, a different story. When he finally retired, there was a kind of silence that followed. It was almost eerie. It was like the game had lost a bit of its primal edge, like that sheer brute force he brought to the pitch was gone, and something was missing. Even people who weren't hardcore rugby fans noticed it. Chabal left a void that no one has really managed to fill since. But the best part about Chabal's story, maybe, is that he didn't really disappear. He found ways to stay involved in rugby, but in his own way. He didn't chase the limelight, but he didn't shy away from it either. He became a bit of a cultural figure in France, popping up in unexpected places. A TV appearance here, a magazine shoot there. He'd always show up looking like that same wild figure from his playing days. And in those rare moments when he'd speak about his career, there was never a hint of regret. He'd talk about rugby like an old friend, like a bond that would never really be broken. In some ways, it's like Chabal became a kind of bridge between eras. Younger fans who'd maybe missed his best days would still recognize him, see his likeness on posters or in old match highlights, and they'd get it. Why he was such a big deal, why people chanted his name. There's something universal about the way he played. You didn't have to understand the rules of rugby to get what Chabal was all about. Just one look at him barreling down the field was enough. And there's another twist to his story that's almost poetic. He never really wanted to be a star. He wasn't in it for the fame or the money. He just wanted to hit hard, to be part of a team, to do his job. But fame, as they say, has a way of choosing its own heroes. And somehow, the French public couldn't help but see in him something a little larger than life. A guy who, in a sport full of strategy and structure, just went out there and made it all look raw, primal, and thrilling. Today, you'll still see Sébastien Chabal's image around. sometimes with that famous, fearsome glare, sometimes with a subtle smirk as if he's in on some joke we're all still figuring out. It's as if he's become a part of the sport's folklore, the same way fans talk about legendary players who defined the game in different eras. In a world that changes constantly, there's something reassuring about characters like Chabal. No polish, no pretense, just a love for the game so pure that it can't help but become iconic. And in the end, maybe that's what Chabal wanted all along. Not to be the best, not to be the flashiest or the fastest, but to be remembered. To give fans something they'd talk about long after the final whistle blew. And he did it in his own unforgettable, one-of-a-kind way. And that's the legend of Sébastien Chabal, the caveman who brought the primal roar back to rugby. A guy who went from accountant to icon, from tackling on the field to tackling fame in his own unique way. Chabal showed us that sometimes sports are about more than the scoreboards and stats. They're about the stories, the faces, and the characters that make the game unforgettable. He may have hung up his boots, but he's still there, a symbol of raw, unfiltered power. And that's why, years later, we still remember him, still talk about him. Because players like Chabal, they don't just fade away. They become part of rugby's myth. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more about the legends who define their sport, make sure to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell. Let us know in the comments, who's a player you think deserves the legend treatment? Until next time, keep that passion for the game alive, just like Chabal did. Thanks for watching.